Hello, this is Tom Chambers for Pokersavvy.com. This is video 4 in the 5-video PLO Fundamentals series. Subject of this video is equity calculations. As I said, this is the fourth part. The first three were respectively. Video 1 was called PLO Core Concepts and covered 6 sort of key things you need to know in order to have a basic understanding of PLO. Second video was on starting hand selection. Third video was a pretty math-heavy video on combinatorics. This fourth video has also got quite a bit of math in it. Obviously, it's just a lot of numbers, basically a lot of equity matchups, and 60-40s here and 70-30s here and so forth, and also a look at I had to build ranges using Pro Poker tools in order to analyze hand versus range equities. The fifth video in the series will be board texture, and be focusing on splitting board textures into categories, understanding how different board textures play, and then also sort of making some points about how board textures in PLO differ from board textures in No Limit Hold'em, whereas some people might be familiar with the latter, but not with PLO equities. Taken together, these 5 videos represent fairly complete picture of the underlying structure of PLO. Its material is mostly taken from volume 1 of my 2-volume book. The book is called Advanced PLO Theory, and if you're curious about it and you don't know about it already, you can check it out at PLOtheory.com. It's where all the information is, including a free preview of volume 1. There's the main structure of the book is that volume 1 sort of lays out all of these fundamental foundational concepts. Board texture, equity, expected value, and game theory are covered as well, and are not covered in this video series. But the goal is to form this underlying theoretical framework and then use it in order to analyze situations. And so the goal of this 5-video series is basically to present a condensed picture of volume 1 of my book. So that said, let's get into equity calculations. 3 different ways we can look at equity. There's hand versus hand calculations, which are pretty straightforward. In a given situation, you can have a board. You can also do a pre-flop, obviously, but in the situations we're going to look at, you'll have a flop. You'll have 2 different specific hands, and the question is which hand is a favorite, by how much. This is the case where you know your hand and your opponent's hand. I have a set, he has a draw. What's my equity against his draw, etc. The second level of analysis that we can do, and this is stuff that should be familiar to anybody who's watching this video as far as just general poker knowledge, that first you can look at hand versus hand calculations, but in order to really understand how to make the best decision, you have to evaluate your hand against the range of opponent hands, because you don't know exactly what he has. This can be pretty complicated to do in PLO, certainly compared with No Limit Hold'em, where you can basically write out 2-card combinations and use PokerStove and other similar tools and calculate hand versus range equities fairly straightforwardly. With PLO, there's a website called ProPokerTools.com. We're actually going to go to the website later in the video and spend some time looking at their simulator. But it effectively works as a PokerStove for PLO. For those who aren't aware of it, obviously you should check it out. Part of the goal of this video is to introduce you to it. But the notation is quite a bit more complicated, and trying to define ranges in PLO is quite a bit more complicated. So we're going to talk a little bit during that section of the video about things to keep in mind, things to watch out for, to sort of avoid making range weighting mistakes. Anyway, that's the sort of the overview of what we'll talk about with the hand versus range stuff. Equity distributions. Again, this is actually a subject that was brought up in videos 1 through 3 in a couple different places, and also is sort of discussed in the third part of this video. An equity distribution is basically a mathematical way of taking the equity on a current street and talking about it in terms of the development of equity over future streets. And so we talked in the pre-flop video quite a bit about pre-flop equity distributions and the idea that a hand might have a hand like King King 7 Deuce Rainbow has a certain amount of equity, but its equity is split into the boards that it hits really hard and the boards that where it has a dry overpair that isn't worth very much. And this idea of that being a polarized equity distribution was a concept from video 2. And we're going to look at some graphs on Pro Poker Tools that help to illustrate some of these points in the third part of the video. All right. There are a handful of hand versus hand equity situations that we can look at. There are actually obviously many, many more than the ones that we have listed here. And in the chapter 4 of the book, which is the chapter that covers equity, there actually are much more in-depth charts than we're going to be looking at today. But obviously for the purposes of this video, I've tried to select the most important matchups and sort of break things down to the to a subset of important matchups that we can look at in a reasonable period of time. So I've chosen these three, in particular the first two, set versus draw, overpair versus draw, and then there's a handful of straight versus draw matchups as well. But that's the main set of hand versus hand matchups we're going to look at, and because the charts that we're going to look at with the different equities listed are a little bit too tricky to put into PowerPoint, we're going to be looking at a spreadsheet that is also going to be downloadable for in the thread, I believe, on this video. Before we get to that, I'm going to point out some notation that you probably haven't seen before, and this is the same notation that I use, that I've introduced in my book in order to describe the strength of different straight draws. So this 11, 6, 0, three numbers listed with slashes between them represent the number of nut, second, and third nut outs. And so an example given here, King Queen 9 on Jack 10 6. There are 4 nut aces, 3 nines, because we have 1 9 in our hand, and 4 8s, and all 11 of those cards give us the nuts, at least the nuts straight. We're ignoring suits for now. Obviously on a rainbow board, all 11 of those cards are actual nut cards. On a suited board, some of them give you the nut straight, or the best possible straight, on a board where a flush is possible. But when we're looking at the defining the notation, at least, those things aren't paid attention to. Clearly, when we look at equity calcs, we'll find that a set versus an 11-6-0 wrap has a certain equity, and a set plus flush draw is obviously a bigger favorite against an 11-6-0 wrap. And generally speaking, wraps are worth a lot less on flush draw boards. And so when we're looking at the actual equity calculations, we'll learn these things. But for now, the notation just refers sort of to ignoring suits. Anyway, as I said, the 11 nut outs for this particular example are the 4 aces, the 3 nines, and the 4 8s. Then there are also 6 second nut outs, the 3 kings and the 3 queens. And there are actually no third nut outs in this particular example. But if we were to look at 9 8 7, which is a low 13 wrap on this board, outs to a queen, and then also to a 9 and 8 or a 7, pairing any of the cards in your hand. The queen and the 9 in that case are both third nut outs, and so that's a significantly weaker draw. I'm not sure exactly what it works out to, but I think it's a 3-3-7. I'm not positive. Don't quote me on that. You could write it out and figure it out if you want to. But anyway, the reason that I'm introducing this and spending 3-4 minutes on it is that when we look at the chart, which is going to be the next thing that we do, the notation is used in order to describe the different wraps, and so it's in order to basically explain what you're going to be looking at. I wanted to do that. All right, here's the point where we're going to break off of the PowerPoint and look at the spreadsheet. As it says here, you can download the Excel sheet in the video description for this video. And I'm just going to sort of slide it into the screen here. The whole spreadsheet is actually a little bit wider and taller than can fit into the screen, so I'll just be sliding through it. What we're looking at right now is some of the sort of the first top half of the spreadsheet on the left side of it. Looking at set versus draw matchups, overpair versus draw matchups, and overpair versus pair plus draw matchups. So there's variation on hands that can have equity against an overpair, and looking at the matchups, adding the pair obviously gives the hand amount of extra equity. Moving rightward, the left column right here covers all of the rainbow matchups. And so if you look closely at the flops that are listed here, all of them are rainbow flops. In every case, hand A and hand B both have one of each suit. So there's no backdoor flush draws. There's no flush draws. It's just sort of the raw set versus draw matchup. Over in the second section, which is visible on the screen right now, we've got now a board where a flush draw is possible. Hand A does not have the flush draw, has exactly one blocker to the flush draw. And hand B, in addition to having the wrap that it had over here, it also adds a flush draw. So we see how much equity adding a flush draw to the wrap is worth. And then can also slide all the way over to the right side, and this is the third column of the spreadsheet, and it goes all the way down. These are the cases where it's hand A that has the flush draw as opposed to hand B. Could also talk a little bit potentially about cases where one hand has a backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draws, and other things like that. That gets into the level of detail that we can't get into in this video. But these three columns cover the main range of hand versus hand situations. Cases where it's a rainbow board and it's without a flush draw involved, and then cases where one variation has the flush draw and case where the other variation has the flush draw. We're going to start out by looking at the set versus draw list, making a couple of points before moving on. Basically just going to highlight some of the key equities and the things that you want to pull from this and try to remember going forward. In the rainbow cases, the first thing to notice is that the 20 wrap possibility, which is fairly rare, but there is a possible 20 wrap on, it turns out, on 65 of the different board textures, which is a significant percentage. It's basically all of the board textures that have three different possible open-enders. So a board texture like Jack 10-6, which has King Queen, Queen 9, and 9-8, you could string all those all those straight draws together and create a 20 wrap. The equity matchup is a slight favorite for the draw in that situation. It's a 54-46 equity favorite. And so you see an example here where top set is not necessarily always going to be the favorite. The current nuts is not always going to be a favorite. And this is a theme that we're going to see in a few other places. The place where the set versus draw matchup, at least in the rainbow case, is basically a straight coin flip, is the 17 wrap. So this is a point that you can remember, I hope, coming out of this video, which is that a 17 wrap is a straight coin flip against the set on a rainbow board. If you then give backdoor flush draws to one hand or the other, that makes a small difference that can sway it one way or the other, but it's basically a 50-50 matchup. Also, if you give blockers to the wrap, that devalues top set a little bit. In other words, if this were King Queen 10-9, it's another 2 or 3 points in favor of hand B because the 10 is a blocker to Jacks filling up. But this falls into the realm of things that we're not going to get into in this video. Moving down the list further, you see the 60-40 matchup for the 13 out wrap. And sort of a practical application of this difference between 17 wraps and 13 wraps is to understand that usually if you have a 13 wrap, if you have a 17 wrap, it is almost never going to be unprofitable to play for stacks, especially for 100 blinds. 17 wrap on a rainbow board. The worst case scenario is actually not running into a set. It's running into some kind of dominating wrap. Like in this case, Ace King Queen Jack has King Queen 9 deuce completely crushed. But most of the made hands that you're going to possibly run up against, including the absolute best hand you could run into, which is top set, in pretty much all of those cases, you're basically a coin flip at worst. And you're going to have usually a significant amount of fold equity involved in getting stacks in. So, opponent leads and you raise in order to stack off. That's almost always going to be profitable, especially given that at worst you're almost always going to be a 50-50 when you get the money in. Compare that to the 13 wrap case, where in the case where you run into a set, you only have 40% equity, and it becomes clear that you need some kind of secondary something, whether it's it's obviously a pair, flush draw or backdoor flush draws. Something like having the difference between having the nut wrap and having a non-nut wrap can be significant, because when you have the nut 13 wrap, you have the possibility of dominating a weaker wrap, and you also have the sort of less of a danger of running into a hand that is a strong made hand that also has a gut shot to a nut gut shot when you have an under wrap, something like that, where your your 60-40 case might be significantly worse. You go further down the list, you see the 9 wrap, 8 wrap, and gut shots, and roughly 30% equity for the straight draw with the open ender. And this is a hand that is usually not strong enough to semi-bluff with. Can occasionally be floated, and depending on the board texture, you can get away with some moves with it. But for the most part, compared with Hold'em, where open enders can often be pretty strong draws, they very rarely are in PLO. And I guess to break down the difference on rainbow boards between 17 wrap, 13 wrap, and open ender, 17 wraps you can almost always sort of indiscriminately stack off. There will be times when there's a more profitable option, but stacking off is almost always going to be profitable. For 100 blinds in a single raised pot, maybe 3 or 4 ways, stacking off with a 13 wrap is not always going to be profitable, but it usually will. And basically what you're looking for is some kind of boost, whether it be additional fold equity, or having the nut wrap against potential lower wraps, or having a pair that gives you extra equity against wraps and a blocker equity against sets. You need something like that in order to turn this sort of what is a worst case 60-40, the times that you get it in against your opponent's range of strong made hands and you're a 60-40 dog. In order to turn that into something that's profitable, you usually need some kind of bonus value when you've got a 13 wrap, and in some cases it would be unprofitable to just stick all the money in with the 13 wrap, but you will have another profitable passive line where you can call and float, or just call and draw. I mean, you've always got the odds to call a pot size bet when you've got a wrap like this, but you don't necessarily it's not necessarily going to be profitable to stick it in against a strong range. Okay, moving to the right, we're going to see how these wraps are affected by adding a flush draw, and there's something that might surprise people, especially at the top end of this chart, which is that when you have a very strong straight draw, you don't necessarily gain a ton of value from adding a flush draw. In the most extreme case here, when you have this 20 wrap, King Queen 9-8 on Jack 10x, and you add a flush draw to it, you actually only add about 3.5% equity against the set. The main reason for this is that a set still has a selection of turn river combinations where it's a guaranteed win. Basically, anytime the board pairs, the set is going to win. And whether you've got a flush draw or not, in addition to your straight draw, it doesn't really matter. The set is still going to win on those cards. So it's got its baseline amount of equity. The second thing that's going on is that it is actually pretty tough on 2 non-pairing cards to make a flush without making a straight when you have a draw this big. The King Queen of diamonds are both in your hand here. The 9, 8, 7, and Ace of diamonds all make you would make you a winning straight and also make you a flush, but as long as the board doesn't pair, you would win either way. So it's not giving you any additional equity. And then basically you would have to catch one of the low diamonds, the 5, 4, 3, or 2 of diamonds, although in this case we got the 2 of diamonds in this guy's hand. And then sort of not make a straight on the river. So you have to catch 5 of diamonds, the 4 of spades or something as the 2 turn the river cards in order for it to make a difference that you have the flush draw. Concept is called, I call it at least, out duplication. And the familiar Hold'em example that I'm sure that some of you are aware of is an open-ender is an 8-out draw, a flush draw is a 9-out draw, but an open-ended straight flush draw is only a 15-out draw because there's 2 cards that are duplicated. There's, for example, if you have Queen 9 of diamonds on Jack 10 of diamonds board, the King of diamonds and 8 of diamonds are cards that both make you a straight and a flush. And there's also the possibility, again, of catching, a low diamond and then a king, which that combination you make the best hand 2 different times and you only need it once. And so in PLO, there's actually a much greater chance of this kind of thing happening because you have 4 cards and because your draws can be so much bigger to start with that there's significantly more. In this case, there were 4 diamonds, the ace, like I said, ace, 9, 8, and 7, that basically were not new outs. So as you get further down and get weaker straight draws, this effect diminishes because you have fewer straight outs, and so the flush outs are worth more. When you get all the way down to having a gut shot and a flush draw, you have 18% more equity than you did in just the bare gut shot case. But generally the matchups kind of top out at a nearly 60-40 edge for the flush draw, or for the straight draw plus flush draw. All right, moving to the further to the right, we've got the cases where the set is now the hand with the flush draw, and compared with the case where we added a flush draw to the straight draw, the set getting the flush draw is worth a ton more additional equity. And the reason for this is basically that it gives the set a bunch of hands and turn river combinations that it would not have won on if it weren't for the fact that it has the flush draw as well. So basically all of those diamonds, the ace of diamonds, 9 of diamonds, 7 of diamonds, and 8 of diamonds that made the straight, both a straight draw, both a straight and a flush, give the straight draw a straight that isn't going to win the hand because the set has a flush draw. So all of those cards shift columns, and we end up with a dominating matchup, 70-30 or so in favor of the set. Okay. Going to move down now to the overpair plus draw, or overpair versus draw matchups. These are the pure overpair versus draw matchups where the drawing hand does not have a pair, and as we'll see below, when you add a pair to the drawing hand against an overpair, adds a significant amount of equity. But anyway, there's some pause. Hey to the editor, I got distracted there and it kind of fizzled out for a few seconds, so just cut this section. All right, moving on to the pair versus overpair versus draw matchups. We've got in the first section here, the second section down, the matchups where the hand does not have a pair, where the hand matched up against the overpair does not have a pair and just has a raw draw. There's still in many cases the hand is a very big favorite against the overpair, and the contrast between the 20 wrap versus an overpair and the 20 wrap versus the set is basically that as soon as the 20 wrap makes its hand, in the case where it's up against an overpair, it has a guaranteed win. In the set versus draw case, it needs to fade the board pairing, and this is worth, in the case of the 20 wrap, it's worth about 20% additional equity. And so when you're holding a 20 wrap, or even a 17 wrap, or even a 13 wrap on in a situation where it's very likely the opponent has an overpair, the main case obviously is 3-bet pots against somebody with a tight 3-betting range, or 4-bet pots against somebody who's always got aces. The bare straight draw can be a significant favorite, and in almost all cases the sort of any straight draw is close to a 50-50. And there's something kind of strange going on here. If you look at or potentially strange, if you look at the open-ender cases, the cases where you've got fewer straight outs, an open-ender is going to complete somewhere around 33 or something like that % of the time. And you see in the case above, the set versus draw case, the open-ender has 27% equity, and this comes from 35% of the time it makes the hand, and then it loses some of those back when the set pairs the river. So if that's where the open-ender is worth, why isn't the overpair versus open-ender case only 35% equity? The reason is actually that it's not just an it's not just an open-ender that the hand has. It also has a bunch of running two pair outs, and there's actually more running two pair and trip outs, and there's actually a significantly more combinations of this than people realize. Anytime that you've got a known flop and two known hands, there are 820 different combinations of possible turn river combinations. You can just take my word for it. If you're interested in the math, it's 41 choose 2, because you know that there are 41 cards left in the deck, and there's 41 choose 2 ways that you can have turn and river. Out of those 820, about 65 or so ways that you can make either running two pair or running trips. There's 12 cards you could catch on the turn that will give you one pair. Any of the kings, jacks, tens, and fours, for example, in this case. In this case right here is what we're looking at. And then there's another 11 cards you could catch on the river to make you the winning hand. So 12 choose 2 or 66 different combinations. That's roughly 8%. And so you add if you have completely live backdoor two pair and trip outs, that adds 8% equity. Now, in most cases, you're not going to have completely live backdoor two pair and trips outs. And for example, in a case that we're going to look at a little bit further down, we give the aces a gut shot, and that takes away a significant amount of the backdoor two pair outs. But as a maximum, you can have as much as 8%, and in most cases it'll add against the reasonable opponent range something like 3, 4, 5% of equity against these medium strength hands. When your opponent has one pair, has an overpair, might have a blocker to one of them, but not to one of your cards, but not all of them. Might be able to make a better two pair on one of your cards, but you can make running two pair that wins on half of those combinations or something like that. And it's especially important when you have this relatively weak draw, because if you have a full wrap, for example, you can't make running two pair because that wins, because you would make a straight on all of those cards when you have the 20 wrap, for example. But when you have a weaker draw like this, that there's a significant number of extra hidden turn and river cards that you win on. Moving to the right and looking at the flush draw cases, we've got significantly more equity added to each of the straight draws by adding a flush draw than in the top case. We still have this effect where, for example, if you have the 20 wrap, you only add it's about 7% equity by adding a flush draw. But the main difference is that all of the cases where you would make a flush and not make a straight become additional wins for you, because you don't have to worry about fading the set pairing the board. So it's worth a little bit of basically every single time that the turn of the river is a diamond, you're going to win. Just like every single time the turn of the river is a straight card, you're going to win. And so all of those cases where you make a flush but not a straight are additional equity to add. And you see that basically it's if you have a flush draw in any other connection with the board, in this case gut shot, and it's the true as well as if you have a single pair and a flush draw, you're in very good shape against bare aces, and almost always will have, given amount of dead money in the pot, a situation where if you're up against a range of aces hands that includes dead aces and a handful of aces hands that dominate you, you're almost always going to be correct to get it in. It's some people who are new to PLO, it's really surprising how much equity sort of seemingly trashy hand can have against bare aces, because there's just there's so many outs that are pretty much entirely live, and that's the main point. Against the set, you have this. A set has a significant number of cards that are set already that are guaranteed wins for it. The overpair doesn't have any of those, and so any way that you can sort of back into something that beats an overpair, you've got a very good chance of winning. Clearly, if you make a weak two pair and then the board pairs the low card on the river, and there are some redraw hands, that some cases where the aces have a redraw, but it's a much weaker situation, obviously, for the player we've got listed as player A here, or hand A. For similar reasons on the reverse side, if you add the flush draw to the overpair, that makes a significant impact and adds as much as 25 or 30% equity against the strongest draws. Main reason for this is that even more so than the set, we have a lot of cases where would lose if not for the flush draw, but win because of the flush draw. All of the times that there are 20 cards that hand B can hit on the turn, that if aces doesn't have an overpair, that this 20 wrap can hit. That if aces doesn't have doesn't have a flush draw, have it drawing dead. Whereas if if aces does have the flush draw, it's got 9 redraw outs. That's a major difference, and there's also obviously 9 cards that it could catch in the turn to have the 20 wrap drawing dead. And so there's a major difference here. I'm realizing now that spending time going through the spreadsheet is taking is two things. One is that I've already made most of the main points that I wanted to make as far as the sort of where these equities come from. I'll make a couple quick points about adding a pair to the draw before we move on. There's actually a couple more sets of draws further down of calculations further down the list. Won't go through the rest of the spreadsheet in order to preserve time, and also because you guys have the ability to download it and look at the matchups that I don't talk about. So the two things I'll talk about before moving on to the hand versus range stuff is when we add a pair to the straight draw. Add at the top end where you've got a big wrap, you add something like 3 or 4% equity. Not very much, and the main reason for that is that most of those, there are quite a few combinations where you make a straight anyway. And also basically where if you make two pair, you've made a straight, and also where even if you make trips, you're going to make a straight on the other card. Hang on, editors, I got to pause again one more time, so I'll be back to pick it up from this point in a little bit. Okay, editors, I'm back. Sorry about that. So we're looking at the overpair versus pair plus draw combinations, and as I was saying, the main difference between the cases where you have just a bare wrap, and when you add a pair to the strongest wraps, to the 17 wraps and so forth, is the cases where you make trips and then you don't make a straight on the other card. So when you've got Jack 10 9 7 on 9 8 2 versus the bare Jack 10 7, you can win by catching a 9 in some blank. But there aren't that many combinations of making trips in a blank, and all the times that you make two pair 9s and 7s or whatever, you end up having a hand that would have won anyway. You make a straight. When you get further down the list to the gut shots and the open-enders and so forth, you're adding a lot more new outs, and it gets back to the point that was made with the open-ender, the bare open-ender in the overpair. Now you're one step closer to making those two pair hands that are going to are not going to duplicate your straight outs and are going to give you a winning hand against aces, or at least a hand that's very likely to win. Obviously, aces can make aces up or trips on the river, but if you have this case here with a gut shot and a pair, now in addition to being able to win on the 10, you can take a big lead on queens, jacks, 9s, and 3s. So you're adding a bunch of additional outs. Anyway, moving to the right, we've got the two different flush draw cases. I'm going to skip over those. I'm going to scan the spreadsheet up to the top and take one quick look at. It's going to take a minute to get this right. At the overpair versus, at the straight draw. Sorry, straight versus. What the hell? This is not getting up there. Straight versus draw cases. So here we go. There's a couple of main matchups here. The nut straight is 65-35 roughly favored against the set. When you give the set a flush draw, it takes a 60-40 lead. When you give the straight draw a flush draw, the straight a flush draw, it actually doesn't make any impact on the equity that the set has, because the set needs to pair the board in order to win either way. What would matter is if the straight had pair blockers, which would add a couple of points of equity, 2 or 3% for pair blockers. The more important thing to look at, the 65-35 or so, is probably something that people understand roughly already, that's about the odds the board's going to pair. More interesting to look at is that the 13 wrap, or the nut 13 wrap, is basically a coin flip against the bare nut straight, and a 17 wrap is a significant favorite. Talk about this a bit in the board texture material as well in lesson 5, video 5, but on board textures where the nut straight is vulnerable to big wraps, having the nut straight or being able to represent the nut straight is not a particularly powerful thing. A board like 10-9-6, which is the example that we're using here, there can be times when you would turn over 8-7 and your opponent wouldn't care. Your opponent would either be a favorite against it or be a coin flip against it, especially if there's flush draw possibilities as well. There's a ton of hands that fall into that category. But you see here, the main cause of this is that a 13-0-0 wrap actually only has 11 outs against the nut straight because there's two blockers in the nut straight hand. But all 11 of those outs are completely pure. As soon as you hit one, it's a guaranteed win. There's no redraw for the flop nut straight, and the same thing is happening with the 17 wrap. As soon as Queen Jack 8 makes the winning hand, catches a king, pairs the Queen Jack or the 8, or catches a 7. There are 15 cards total that fall into that group. The 17, normally it's a 17 out wrap, but there's two blockers in the straight hand. All 15 of those outs are 100% live, and this is one thing that you see a 15 out wrap. 15 out straight draw, flush draw combination against a set. It's not nearly a 60-40. It's actually a little bit worse than 50-50 in the other way. We saw one of those. I don't want to try to flip up to it. We saw one of those examples. If you want to contrast it with the set versus open ender plus flush draw, similar number of quote unquote outs, but the lack of a redraw is so significant when you have the bare nut straight here. And if you actually break out the number of turn river combinations on which 8-7 has the nuts on this board, it's extremely low. It's like 15 or 20% or something like that. And clearly also when you add a flush draw to the straight draws, you're adding a significant extra amount of equity. All right. That's going to wrap it up for talking about the spreadsheet. There's a few things that percentages that we didn't look at, especially the value of adding a straight draw to the overpair. And I guess I'll just point that section out right now, and you can look at it on your own in the spreadsheet. It's right here is when we add the gut shot to the overpair and give it a significant amount of open ender to the overpair and give it a significant number of blockers against the wrap, and it's very similar to against the different wraps and open enders, and it's very similar to what happened when we added a flush draw to the overpair, which is that a ton of the bad cards get neutralized or a redraw is created, and so you get a significant difference. Okay, I'm going to close the spreadsheet now and move on to Pro Poker Tools. Here we're going to look at hand versus range equity, and I'm going to talk before we go plug stuff in on Pro Poker Tools about what these numbers represent, what these codes represent, and sort of how you can make the right decisions about balancing a range, constructing a range in order to get the right mix of hands. Sorry about that. So here we got a board, really wet board, Jack 10-6 with the flush draw possible, and want to ask the question: what kind of hands are people likely to play for a large amount of money on these boards? What kind of hands are the combo draws? What kind of hands are the big, the sets and the big other two pair hands and so forth, big nut flush draws, and also how do we represent them in the right proportion to how often people are going to actually have them in their pre-flop ranges, and that's the key to understanding how to use Pro Poker Tools. Some people will take a look at this board and basically just put in Jack Jack star star, 10-10 star star, and Ace of Hearts, Star of Hearts, Star Star, and that covers all of the nut flush draw combinations, all of the set combinations, top and middle set combinations, and that may not be realistic for people's opening ranges. And so in order to understand what this notation represents, let me explain the different letter codes. First of all, N represents all of the cards between king and 9. It's non-low cards is where the N comes from, compared with cards that are low and Omaha 8 or better. So King Queen 10-9, King Queen Jack 10-9, and so with this notation right here, N, we're capturing a lot of the two pair hands, a lot of the open ender plus one pair hands, King Queen Jack 9, open ender, one pair plus wrap. Hands like King Queen Jack, over pair plus open ender plus one pair, are all included in this group. And the key, one of the key factors in terms of balancing the range correctly is that just about all of those hands are in people's pre-flop ranges. And as a basically a concern that you might run into, and that we're going to see when we look at Jack-Jack combinations, is that there are some combos that people aren't going to play in pre-flop, and they're going to be underweighted pre-flop. But with the NNN group, that is basically a group which makes up roughly, as it says here, it actually makes up about 2% of all hands, or 1.8 or something like that. But given that there's a Jack and a 10 on the board, the percentage is lower. It's about 1.5% of all hands. But all of those hands are in people's starting hand ranges, and all of those hands like this board. They're either, like I said, pair plus wrap, two pair, or over pair plus straight draw. A couple of counter or sets. Sets are in there as well. A good percentage of the sets. Similarly, when you add an ace to 3 end cards, you're going to get a lot of ace jack 10 9, ace king queen jack. These are all hands that people are playing pretty much 100% of the time, and that also hit this board pretty much 100% of the time. So they all belong in the range. And then you got NNN8, which does basically the same thing. It gives you some of the lower wraps. Now, there's plenty of overlap between, actually, I'm sorry, there's not overlap among these three groups, but there's overlap between these three groups and some of the groups over here, particularly these two. And so when we add up all the different range balance percentages, it's going to add up to a bit more than 6.9%. And the reason is that there's some hands that are duplicated. For example, Jack 10 9, as it says here, is both in this group because there are 4 ends, and it's in this group because it has 2 jacks, an N, and some other card. And when Pro Poker Tools runs ranges, it basically sort of recognizes this and only includes the hand ones. The reason that we choose Jack N star and 10 M star, let me see if I can pull up the Pro Poker Tools. I think I can possibly do this where I've got both things up at once. All right. Here's the syntax. Sorry, it's going to take a second. Yeah, it looks like it's still, because I'm being kind of stupid. I'm going to have trouble getting it. Okay, so here we go. Is that even the right one that I want to look at? Yeah, here we go. So down here at the bottom, you see what what these different notations mean. Not all of them are being used in this range, but some of them are. And you can use the B notation to represent any ace, king, queen, or jack. Use the M notation to represent any 10, 9, 8, or 7. Z and L are ones that we're not looking at here, but you see what they are. The N notation is particularly useful because there's a lot of sort of mid-high hands that are covered well by using a bunch of the N's, as we've done here. And that's king, queen, jack, 10, 9. Doesn't include an ace, and so you gotta, if you want to include the hands that have an ace in them, you got to make a different grouping. But anyway, that's this notation. And the reason that we use Jack N star and 10 M star is that it is very unlikely that people are going to be playing pre-flop all combinations of jacks. And Jack N star captures roughly half of all the Jack combinations. There's a couple ways you could know this. One of them is, and we're going to look at this in a second on Pro Poker Tools, you can use the count feature, which is in the new Pro Poker Tools beta, and actually see this percentage and understand as a percentage of Jack's hands as well what percentage fall into this Jack N star category. So I'll show you how you do that in a second. But also you could realize that based on the combinatoric stuff we looked at in last lesson, set of jacks is, if people play 100% of their range pre-flop, is about 1.5% of all starting hands. Jack N star being about 0.8%, you can see it's roughly half of the Jack's combinations. So basically what we're doing is we're eliminating all of the hands like Jack 8 deuce, Jack 7 deuce, Jack 7 5, and so forth. Now this might not completely capture which jacks combinations the guy's going to play, but it's close enough, and it more or less does a better job than any other 50% mix would do, and it gives that one extra card that leads the hand towards having a straight draw redraw, which sets of jacks and sets of 10 combinations are very likely on this board going to have, or some of them are going to have a straight draw redraw. So here we've got all the king Jack X, queen Jack X, Jack 10X, and Jack 9X. Hands fall into this category. With tens, it's all of the combinations that have at least 1 9 8 7 in them. Now, obviously, you're also going to be playing hands like king queen 10 10, and those aren't captured here. But for the overall mix, it's not that big of a deal because we've got a bunch of open-ended and wrap, straight draw and wrap hands captured over here. And let me try to think if there's any. Actually, you know what? There aren't any of those. This is something that's covered by the NNNN. King Queen 10-10, for example, is in this group. 10-10-9-7 is not in this group, but it is in this group. And so you capture most of the playable tens hands. 6-6-MM gives us sort of a small slice of sets of sixes hands, assuming that people aren't playing most 6-6-XX hands, but will play when they have two connected side cards. And then these mixes over here give us some of the flush draw hands with mixes of side cards that sort of do a combined job of number one, sort of representing the hands that people are likely to play pre-flop, and then also just representing the correct proportion of hands that are going to have that that combination. So, yeah, there are going to be some nut flush draw hands that don't have two end cards in them. They're going to be, ace of hearts with 3 low cards that include, ace 7 6 5 4, or that's too many cards, ace 7 6 5 or whatever. But there also are going to be a handful of hands like, I don't know, ace queen 9 2 that aren't in people's ranges. And so from terms of counting the total number of combinations, this captures it just about right. And for the most part, it captures putting the right hands in the group. And so those two things together are what you should be looking for when you're trying to build a range. All right, I'm going to look fully at Pro Poker Tools now and show you there's their simulation tool. So here we've got this board. This is the board that we were looking at before, actually, that 10-9-6 board. So I'm going to replace this with Jack of Hearts, 10 of Diamonds, 6 of Hearts, and then I'm going to include, copy and paste this entire range in there for one of the hands, and then compare you can go hand versus range calculation. It's pretty straightforward. I'm not going to spend too much time showing you how to type things in, but yes, we got ace king queen of hearts with a dangler, and then hand versus range. We know that this is a 13 wrap plus a flush draw, and so it's doing fairly well. It was lots of 50-50s and 60-40s against the strong hands on the board when we were looking at the hand versus hand calcs, and then we see that range versus hand, it ends up being 56%. In the book, there's a section on hand versus range equities where I break down, I create 10 of these ranges, 10 different boards, and to do a bunch of the sort of internal hand versus range matchups, basically running most of the interesting hands in here against the entire range. Can't really do a structured presentation of that in this video, and so I'm just going to stop this part of the discussion right here and say that I hope the main lesson that you learned here is things to think about when you're balancing the range, and then once you've got a range created, you can for yourself plug in different hands and see the simulation. One thing that I'll move on, before moving on, we will look at this count feature. This is going to be a tool that makes it a lot easier for you to calculate the combinatorics and balance the range without necessarily knowing a lot of things off the top of your head or studying the work for yourself. What I've got in here right now, and I should do this right before making the video, is that entire range given these 3 dead cards. And that tells us that, if you remember from the third video, 211, 876 is the number of total hands, or total possible starting hands given a 49 card deck. In other words, we took these 3 cards out. These are the 211,876 possibilities left. This number tells us that roughly 14,000 of those fall into this group, which is where I get this 7% total frequency. So this is 7% of all starting hands. Now this might mean if somebody's got, if this mix NNN etc. represents appropriately a bunch of hands that people are playing pre-flop. In other words, all of this range is in their pre-flop range, and the guy plays 30% of hands. And what we're actually talking about with 7% of all starting hands, and he's playing 30% of all hands, is something like 20 or 25% of his pre-flop range. So if we're drawing a line and saying people are going to stack off with these hands on this board, and the guy plays 30% of his hands, he's going to be stacking off something like 20 or 25% of the time. And you can make sort of use this combinatorics to make those kind of judgments and understand how often they're going to be bet folding, how often they're going to be, if there's a 3 or 4 way pot, how often one person is going to have a stack offhand. You can make those kind of judgments. In order to break down sort of individual pieces, for example, let's say you want to know how many combinations of Jack-Jack are in people's preflop ranges total. Given that there's one on the board, it's roughly 1.5% of all hands. There's a few different ways you might want to try to design a smaller Jacks range in order to cover a percentage of the hands. The one that we used was Jack-Jack N-Star, where you see about 0.8%, which is roughly 60% of all Jacks hands. Or you could do something as narrow as Jack-Jack Big-Big, where you're only looking at hands like Ace-King Jack-Jack, Ace-Queen Jack-Jack, and that's only 0.1% of all of the hands. Or you could do, if you want a little bit less than 50%, you could do Jack-Jack Big Star, which gives you the only Ace, King, and Queen are the only cards that, this does actually include the handful of trips hands, but that's such a small percentage, it's not a big deal. But otherwise, you need an Ace, a King, or a Queen, which is only 3 different possible cards. It's going to be a significantly lower percentage than the Jack-Jack N-Star. And there you go, 0.7%. Which is less than 50% of all of the Jacks hands in this board. So you can play around with this and obviously use the count feature in order to make these range weighting adjustments. And whether you understand exactly what hands should be in this range or not, you might say it's reasonable on this 9-high board that I give him 30% of the sets of the pocket nines combinations, and then play around with figuring out which how you could end up selecting that number of pocket nines combinations. All right, so that's hand versus range equities. And pretty much all that we have time to talk about with that today. Now we're going to talk about equity distributions, and for a minute going to get off of the Pro Poker Tools, though we're going to go back to it and talk on this slide on the PowerPoint presentation for a minute. Definition of an equity distribution is a picture of an equity matchup on one street in terms of the range of possible equities depending on the next card. So a pre-flop equity distribution, which is something that we looked at a bit in the starting hand video. We're talking about polarized equity distribution versus smooth equity distribution. Is basically a way of saying, I know that Queen Jack 10-9 double suited has 45% equity against aces pre-flop. But a more interesting question than just the raw pre-flop equity is on how many boards does it have 80 or 90% equity? And how many boards does it have 70%, 60%, 50%, 30%? And you can use this information. One main application of it is to know when you're in a 4-bet pot, the decision to stack off is not, or decision to play for stacks against known aces is not dependent on what your preflop equity is. It's on the combination of how often you flop a certain threshold equity that is good enough to stack off, whether it be 30 or 33%, depending on stack sizes, and then what your average equity is in those cases. And so that's. And there's actually, I believe, in the free preview of my book, I think I have the section on that, or a piece of the section on that in there. It's possible I don't. I'm not sure, but it's not something we're going to be able to look at fully today. But when we look at the graphs on Pro Poker Tools, I will at least sort of make a couple comments along those lines. So we're going to look at the example of a really smooth distribution. That's the Queen Jack 10-9. Look at an example of a really polarized distribution. That's the King King 7 deuce. And then we're also going to look at one flop to turn example. And in this case, we're going to look at basically looking at a flop equity matchup in terms of what happens when we move to the turn, what frequency the different hands are going to be ahead on different turn cards, and how far ahead they're going to be. That's the 3 different matchups we're going to look at, and I think this is the last slide of the video. Yes. All right. So I'm going to pull up Pro Poker Tools again and go to the graphing feature. We're on it right now, the simulator. So we're going to, first of all, we're going to look at, oops, sorry about that. We're going to look at ace ace star star against, what was it, queen of, doesn't really matter, but queen of spades, jack of clubs, 10 of clubs, 9 of spades. So again, we could look at the simulate and see, it's 58-41, a little bit less than I estimated. One thing that's interesting about this hand is that it suffers a little bit. Let me just show you something small. this hand and this hand seem extremely similar. They're both pure rundowns. The Queen Jack 10-9 double suited and 9-8-7-6 double suited, both pure rundowns, and both have two suits. But so you might think that they have similar equity, but actually, you see that 9-8-7-6 double suited actually has 3% more equity than Queen Jack 10-9 double suited. The reason for this is something called the proximity effect, which is that Queen Jack 10 uses an ace for a decent number of its straights, and a decent number of the times that it makes two pair, a random hand that has an ace in it has a reasonable chance of making a straight. Obviously, not every time, but on a board like King Queen 10, two pair is going to be good less often against aces than on a board like 9-7-6. And so, combination of those things add together to make the lower rundown hands actually significantly better to have against aces than the higher rundowns. This effect is, or the blocker effect is really obvious if you have an ace in your hand, but some people don't realize, I don't think, how much it can matter that you have Broadway cards versus middle cards. All right, that's just a small thing, and I want to move back and look at this equity distribution. All right. So here we go with a pretty smooth equity distribution. We have the equity for aces against the other hands. Actually, I wanted to flip it. Doesn't matter. But I wanted to, the graph that this graph is the graph for equity of aces versus this specific hand. If we flip the hands like this, it's going to give the other graph, and it's basically just going to be an inversion of this graph. It's going to look very similar. It's going to sort of go like this, just the reflection across that diagonal line. But I wanted to be talking about this as the equity of the rundown hand. So here we see the percentage of flops. Here we see the equity. And what this graph represents is basically for every point along the curve, it tells us an equity amount and the frequency with which this hand has at least that equity against this hand. And so if we go right to here, this 80% mark being right on the 10% percentage of flops, that means that 10% of the time, Queen Jack 10-9 double suited has at least 80% equity against aces. So these are all the flops where it like flops the nut straight and aces only has, way up here, it flops the nut straight and aces only has a running full house redraw, or cases where it flops, a huge wrap and flush draw combination. It has like 75% equity or whatever, so that's right in there. But basically all of these are the cases where it outflops aces. And actually most of the time that means it outflops it with a straight or a flush, as opposed to two pair where aces actually has a decent amount of redraw equity, and it probably falls into this group. And then aces has either basically no redraw in the cases where it only has a running boat, or possibly it's it's got there's a flop straight but aces has a flush draw or something like that. Well, actually, that one would be in here as well. Anyway, these are the I'm probably getting into too much detail and also making some slight mistakes. Point is that right up here, we're looking at all of the flops where Queen Jack 10-9 clearly crushes, flops well out flops aces, and then we're sort of moving down, and we're looking at 30% of the time it's going to have at least 55% equity, and so these are boards where, including boards with like a pair plus an pair plus wrap are probably up in here, pair plus a flush draw or something like that. Some of those cases are going to be down in this area, and we see that sort of the midpoint, 50% equity is going to be, 50% of flops, it's going to have about 40% equity at least. We talked a little bit about using this for the 4-bet pot discussion and 4-bet pot situation. If aces 4-bets, if bets are all pot size, they're all outside of the blinds, and the stacks are 100 BBs. In other words, we're playing 5-10 and it goes pot size raise, pot size re-raise, and then another pot size re-raise by the aces hand, and nobody was in the blinds. The amount of money that gets in pre-flop, it turns out, is $375, 37.5 big blinds. That creates a situation where if aces has 4-bet to that percentage of stacks and shoves every flop, the hand that's facing the 4-bet needs 31% equity to call the flop. And so when you're making the decision pre-flop as to whether or not this is a correct hand to call with, you need to know not what its pre-flop equity is, but how frequently it has more than 31% equity. And then how much total equity it has in those cases. And using this graph to calculate that is kind of complicated. There's actually, I think on 2+2 in a couple places, there's threads where people went through it, and I think it's available in other places that you could probably search for this topic and find information on the internet somewhere. It's definitely in my book. But can't really get into it today. But the idea is that you can look at an equity distribution graph and understand Queen Jack 10 9 double suited is going to flop well enough to stack off more than 60% of the time, and a lot of those times it's going to have 50, 60, 70% equity. It's most likely profitable to call this 4-bet, and it turns out if you were to if you run the full calculation, you make something like 7 or 8 big blinds by calling the 4-bet with this hand. Okay, let's look at the Rainbow Kings example. All right. So first of all, shouldn't surprise you that this hand doesn't have very good equity against aces, only about 20%. Basically needs to flop a set or make a set by the river. It also has a much different looking distribution graph. And what's going on here is that basically on its top 10%, 12% of flops, it flops a set on non-ace high boards. In other words, it flops top set about 10% of the time. And all those boards, it's way ahead. It's got 80, 85% equity. And there's a handful of boards where it flops quads right up here, where aces is basically drawn dead. Then there's a huge drop-off. These middle flops here from about 10% to 15%, where it's dropping from 75% equity to 30%, are flops where it flops, basically where it flops bottom 2 pair. So 7-2, Queen 7-2, all of those boards, and where it flops trips, trip deuces, trip sevens, those are up in here. In some cases, aces will have, in all of these, against its sets and its trips and its 2-pair hands, will have flush draws, will have straight draws, so it could have some equity. That's why the curve isn't just, straight across. It's smooth, and it's depending on aces side cards. But once you get down to past the top 15% of flops, you've got this next little segment where you flop bottom pair or middle pair with the 7 or the 2, and it gives you a few extra 2-pair outs in addition to the chance of turning or rivering a king. You can make trip sevens or sevens and deuces. And then the remaining 60% of flops or so, all you've got are a set draw, and then the very last slice where aces has flopped a set itself, you basically have no equity. And if you think about that 4-bet pot case, Kings has greater than 30% equity very, very rarely. And so even not only because it has such low equity overall, but because it has so few flops on which it can stack off in a 4-bet pot. It's a hand that's terrible to call a 4-bet with if you know the guy has aces. All right, the last graph we're going to look at is this flop distribution. And what this equity distribution graph does, it basically takes whatever street of information you give it, it just looks at the next street. And so here we're looking at, given our pre-flop ranges, we're looking at, or hand in range, we're looking at the flop distribution. If you put a board in, what do we got here? 9-8-4 with clubs. And we're given the 2 real monster hands, given the set a backdoor flush redraw, and then putting a monster wrap. I think it's, whoops, sorry, I guess I should just look at what I wrote in here. 7 of clubs, 6 of spades. No. Oh, there's a mistake there. All right. I don't know if this was on my end or what, but I did not intend to give the Jack 10 7 6 hand a better backdoor flush draw. So we're going to take that away and just sort of recognize there's a slight difference between what's on the spreadsheet or what's on the PowerPoint and what we're looking at. So here's the graph. 41 turns dealt, given that we know 3 cards, 4 cards, 4 cards, 11 cards total. There's only 41 possible turn cards. Given that we have specific cards placed in these specific hands placed in here and here. We've only got these 41 possibilities. On the previous case where we had a random aces hand or range in one of these slots, they had to deal a lot of different combinations because they had to basically run a bunch of different side card possibilities with a bunch of different flop possibilities in order to generate the graph. So this graph is actually only dealing with 41 different cases, and you can basically break down piece by piece what each slice represents. This slice here represents, it should be a straight across line. For some reason it curves down a little bit, but basically the top 7 out of 41, about 18% of turns are cases where the board pairs and the straight draw is drawing dead, the big draw is drawing dead. So this is the case 9, the 3/8s, and the 3/4s. Got another small slice here of cards where the set picks up a flush draw. So when you and I guess to understand what's going on there, let's look down at this slice first. These are the cards where the set picks up a flush draw and a straight is not made. These right here are the cards where there's a blank and so the 2 of diamonds or whatever, and the set still has a few blanks left and also has the board pairing cards, and the big draw has all of its outs still. It turns out the big draw has more than 20 outs. It has roughly, I think it's 23 total outs, and that gives it 42.5, 57.5 to 42.5. Yeah, it has 23 outs. And so it's actually still a favorite on the turn cards. We didn't look at actually let's back up a quick second and look at the simulation. Yeah, the wrap plus flush draw is a 55% favorite. And then these cards right here represent, it's still a 55% favorite, actually slightly better than that, on blank non-spades, where it still has all of its straight cards and all of its flush cards. Pairing the board on the turn is a really important win for the set, and a lot of its equity comes from those cases. And then these last set of cases are basically the cases where this hand makes completes its draw, and then the set has to redraw and hit the set. This slice right here are cards that give the set a backdoor flush draw, and are blanks that give the set a backdoor flush draw, therefore taking away a handful of the straight outs, which is why the set has a little bit more equity on those cards. All right, there's obviously a lot more that we could get into with equity distributions and even the graphs that we looked at. Clearly, you could study them a bit further and learn some more. I hope this was a decent overview. Looking back at the hand versus hand calculations, you can download that spreadsheet from the thread on this. I believe it's going to be from the thread on this video. It'll be clear where it is. I'm not sure exactly how they do that, but it'll be downloadable, and you can look at all of the calculations in more detail. And then the hand versus range stuff. The main lessons to learn were how you use the different notation pieces, especially the rank codes, in order to write realistic ranges. There's a couple things we didn't get into, mainly because the Pro Poker Tools beta is pretty new, and he's just added a bunch of new notation, including this intersection operator, which lets you basically take two codes and say this is to pick hands that only that exist in both groups. You can use a code that says a particular group excluding hands that fall into this small subgroup, and then there's some more combination ways that you can use those tools. But didn't have enough time to get into that today, but it's definitely interesting and important stuff. And then the equity distribution stuff. Mostly I just want you guys to have a qualitative understanding of what's going on there, why it's important to look ahead to the next street, and how you can view this graph sort of as a visual representation of how equity splits over future streets. And refer back to the discussion in the starting hands material as well about polarized versus smooth distributions. All right, that's going to wrap it up. Look forward to video 5, most likely later this week. It should be coming out on Friday, and that will be video 5 will be my last video with Pokersavvy, and it'll be on board texture.